So my name is Gretchen Fitzgerald, and I'm the National Program Director for Sierra Club Canada Foundation. And we are a national environmental organization that works on a grassroots basis to tackle issues that people care about in their communities. And I have a long history with the Atlantic Canada chapter, and the chapter here in Atlantic Canada has programs to protect wildlife and wildlife habitat. And in the room we have Wanda Baxter, who heads up our Watch for Wildlife program aimed at preventing wildlife collisions on our roads. We also get kids outside through our Wild Child Nature Immersion program and forest school. We act to present solutions to climate change, like shutting down coal, and promote renewable energy and energy efficiency. And we support grassroots action. And, Lisa mentioned the review of SIA that's going on now. We were able, because we have people on the ground like Wanda, to provide expertise to those consultations, and we will continue to do so. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about why we care about the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But I think there's a lot of relevance to what I'm going to say to the issues off of Nova Scotia as well. I'm going to talk about some of the history of the campaigning to protect the Gulf. Do a bit of reflection on the campaign that started back in 1999 to protect the Gulf versus the more recent one that started about, I'm saying recent, started about 9 years ago. So the second round of threats to the Gulf. So sort of then versus now. Talk about some lessons learned from doing this over so many years with so many different people. And perhaps to frame our discussion after the break, some of the tactics that have been used, brief evaluation of them. I won't be able to go in depth just because of time constraints, but maybe that'll provide sort of an impetus for our discussion going forward. So our latest battle to protect the Gulf happened at around the same time as this was happening, a major blowout in the Gulf of Mexico. And a lot of us watched in horror as oil spilled uncontrollably for about 5 months from that well. It started in the summer, and at the end of the spill, about 4 to 5 million barrels of oil had been spilled into that ecosystem. 11 people were killed and 17 were injured. The ecological toll of the spill, of course, continues to this day. And the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association of the States, so NOAA, has looked at the big picture impacts of what this spill did. And they're showing that the 21 species of whale that are present in the area showed demonstrable injuries because of that spill. So all of those species were impacted. Populations of bottlenose dolphins are projected to be hardest hit, and bottlenose whales, and they're expected to decline by half. Thousands of sea turtles were impacted, potentially killed by the spill. The estimate is between 55,000 and 167,000 turtles, juveniles to adults, were killed by that spill. So that's a lot of animals. And of course, because the oil went to coastal areas and destroyed plants and wetlands that are there that prevent erosion, in some areas like states like Louisiana, the rate of erosion, which is already a serious problem because of climate change, has increased because the plants that live there no longer exist. It's also thought that the damage to oysters, which are a very important industry in the Gulf, may result in populations of oysters in the Gulf of Mexico, that fishery not being sustainable over the long term. And there's folks in this room who I know are very expert in dispersants. Some of the impacts that they list have to do with the actual response. So some of the chemicals that were actually used to clean up the spill increased the damage and were implicated in health consequences for the cleanup workers and people in coastal communities. As this was happening, an oil company proposed doing some exploration in the Gulf of St. Lawrence at a site known as Old Harry. And the photo behind the map is taken off of Western Newfoundland. The location of Old Harry is about 80 kilometers off Western Newfoundland. So a junior exploration oil company called Corridor Resources wanted to look for oil and gas there. They chose an area that is considered under the jurisdiction of the Canada, Newfoundland, and Labrador Offshore Petroleum Board. And how this usually works when a company is interested in looking for oil, they usually start by shooting seismic. And folks may or may not know, seismic testing involves shooting air guns, so intense noise that penetrates the seabed and tells oil companies the type of oil that might be there and the quantities in the detail that they need to proceed with their development. These guns, air guns that produce the noise, can go on every few seconds for days or even weeks at a time. So the thought of seismic blasting and looking for oil in the Gulf created such a pushback that the oil regulator, the Canada, Newfoundland, and Offshore Petroleum Board, felt it had to respond. And why were people so engaged or enraged to think that this would happen? The Gulf of St. Lawrence is a very, very special place. It's far, far smaller, about 6.5 times smaller than the Gulf of Mexico. And the water in the Gulf circulates in a counterclockwise current, meaning that if oil spilled, has been mentioned in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, it could impact the coastlines of 5 of Canada's 10 provinces. The system is fed by the St. Lawrence River, and then icy Labrador currents come from the north through the Strait of Belle Isle, and they mix with warmer waters coming from the Scotian shelf, some of which sometimes even tropical waters coming up from the Gulf Stream. There's intrusions. This type of mixing of different types of water and temperatures and the varying depths in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, you have really deep water and then really shallow areas. I mean, a lot of folks may be familiar with swimming in the Northumberland Strait and how warm it gets in the summertime. This range of depths and temperature and variety of habitats means that different species, such as cod, can use different areas for spawning, nursing, and migrating. They can be there all year round, meaning there's very few times when it's safe, quotation marks, to go in there and do the type of risky activity involved with seismic testing and oil and gas development and exploration. I should also note that the Gulf is covered by ice for parts of the year, and it has been noted that there is no process or response in place now to respond to a spill on the ice, which is, I think, part of the reason why we've seen parts of the Arctic recently called it off limits to oil and gas development. Some of the endangered species that make their home in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, because it is so vibrant and productive and diverse, include cod populations, which have been designated as endangered by the committee that assesses species as endangered in Canada. So cod populations, we've got deepwater redfish, the leatherback sea turtle, wolffish, and of course, species that's very dear to my heart, the blue whale, of which there's only about 250 individuals, it's estimated, left in the Northwest Atlantic, and they go in there to feed on krill. And so they make their home there for parts of the year. There's other creatures that are there all year round. People like Mary Gorman, who's dedicated her life to protecting the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and she heads up the Save Our Seas and Shores Coalition. People like Farley Mowat, who I was privileged to meet in the last years of his life, and some of his last activism was dedicated to protecting the Gulf. People like Marilyn Clark, who's sitting, I think, on a crab boat there, who, wants to work in the fishery and has, relations with, and her, her partner works in the fish industry, so would love to continue to live there and raise her family, relying on the vibrant fishery. People like, who's not pictured here, Greg Eagleson, who represents 450 herring fishermen in the Gulf. And Alistair Marshall, who's no longer with us, but was one of the key elders who spoke up from the Gulf way back when some of these campaigns started, back in the late 90s, and represented the Mi'kmaq communities as an elder and really spoke up from that perspective. This is a really important place to our GDP. It's been estimated 1/5. I know GDP is a false measure of economic development, but it is something. 1/5 of the GDP from all of Canada's marine industries comes from this spot. And if you reflect on it, a lot of the iconic seascapes and beaches that we think of when you think of the Maritimes are here. So off Cape Breton, the Northumberland Strait, Prince Edward Island. These places are visited and photographed by thousands of tourists every year. And people are taking action. As I mentioned, when seismic testing was proposed, the response was unprecedented. The Offshore Board in Newfoundland said we've never gotten such a response. And that was because 50 groups and individuals wrote in. That number has grown and grown and grown since we woke up to this problem back when Corridor proposed this development. Because of this concern, the Offshore Board actually did write to then Minister of Environment Kent and said, help, we need help, there's opposition, we don't know what to do, and they actually asked for the highest level of environmental assessment possible in Canada at the time, which was a panel review or a mediation. The then Minister of Environment wrote back saying, sorry, no, we're not going to do that. So an environmental assessment panel would have done something at least to reassure us that there would have been an arm's length look at this development. Instead, Minister Kent bounced the ball back to the board, and for the last about 9 years, we've been in various processes that were supposed to encapsulate concerns, carry out the obligation to consult with communities, particularly Indigenous communities, and to sort of incorporate those concerns and decisions. Clearly that hasn't happened, or we would have that license to explore canceled, which hasn't happened, unfortunately. Other things that have happened is 7 municipalities on PEI have called for a moratorium on oil and gas exploration in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The Magdalen Islands has also passed a resolution against oil and gas development. The Standing Committee on Fisheries, Transportation and Rural Development, PEI, also passed a resolution calling for a moratorium. And in 2014, perhaps one of the most significant developments in decades, the chiefs of Indigenous communities, so the Mawsey, Mi'kmaq, and Innu communities of the Gulf of St. Lawrence called for a 12-year moratorium on oil and gas and development in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Our coalition and our voices have grown, but unfortunately I'm sad to report to you, and a lot of you actually have played a role in growing those voices. As of January 2015, the license to do exploration at Old Harry was actually extended by the Offshore Board beyond the 9-year period that is supposed to be allowed under the Accords Act. So behind all of those things, as you can imagine, there was a lot of activism and action that took place. And as I mentioned, we've been here before. There's been many reports that have shown that oil and gas is not appropriate. This is a picture that was taken from the old battle that happened in the late 1990s, a film that was made called Battle at Our Shores by Neil Livingston. You know, at that time, there was also a lot of work done to show that the Gulf of St. Lawrence, places like coastal Cape Breton, are not an appropriate place for things like oil rigs. And so we've learned a lot from what we've done, and many reports have been commissioned. And I was reflecting last night on what has changed. And this is sort of a then versus now table. And I'd say one of the key things that's changed for our battle is we do have less engagement from the fishing industry, but greater engagement from the leadership of the Indigenous communities. We have a bigger scope, which actually is, it's actually sometimes harder to get action if you're not just talking to one provincial government, you're trying to get action in 5. In general, as I say, there have been numerous reports, I can't even go through all of them, starting in 1971, showing how important this ecosystem is. They are still largely being ignored. I will say there has been a change in how Environment Canada and DFO are treating this situation. Way back when we fought seismic shooting off coastal Cape Breton and actually failed and seismic went forward. It went forward partly because the Department of Fisheries and Oceans said they were going to do a study of seismic on crabs by putting some crabs down below the air guns while they're being shot. Now we do see Environment Canada and DFO saying in a very vocal way to the Offshore Board in Newfoundland, modeling of oil spills is inadequate. unfortunately, a lot of their advice is not being incorporated as far as we can tell. And John will probably talk a lot about flaws in the regulatory system. So all of this stuff may look like a lot of fun, but it's a lot of work. And so some of the lessons learned, the regulatory system is broken. It's mostly an avenue for delay. And I will say one of our victories is we have delayed this development for almost a decade, and we will continue to do so until we get it stopped. So the regulatory system is an avenue for delay, even though it's broken. Largely, recently, MPs and MLAs will defer to the boards. And they may recommend things, but they, in this last case where we saw a license extended beyond what the Accords Acts anticipated, they deferred to the board's judgment. I do think key successes rely on engagement from the fishing industry, and it's something we need to work on in our battle. It sounds like you have huge capacity here. This is a nonpartisan issue, and by that I mean we have seen bad decisions on the Gulf of St. Lawrence under Liberals, Conservatives, and to some degree NDP. So this is not about who's in charge, it's about who's calling the shots. And I think in many cases, as has been alluded to or even said, it's often the oil and gas industry and their power. And finally, don't quit. There's so many ways to take action. I think the devotion print that's on sale here, you may feel like you're in that little dory, but there's many ways to get up those waves and many ways to do it. And there are going to be so many stages in your battle and in our battle together, and so many directions we can take. But often the key, and that's why grassroots action is so important, because you're there and you're not going anywhere. You're going to be there to respond no matter what comes at you, so don't quit. And those are some of the tactics. I've run out of time, so I will go through them. But those are some of the tactics that we might think about as we do our discussions this afternoon that have been engaged in to varying levels of success. And I think with the opportunities for regulatory reform that are happening federally, there are some real opportunities for merging action on specific assaults to ecosystems like Old Harry to regulatory reform, and I hope that's what's going to come out of our discussion today. So thank you very much.